So I thought I would just say something in the first, maybe third of the talk about Ireland and Finland and why it's an interesting comparison. I put the slides together in a certain order, but I haven't travelled with my computer, so this is now, I haven't seen them for a few days, so I'll just do that. And then what I've been working on recently, and partly as reflected in the book that Peter was telling you about there, is I was told, I'll come on to this later, but I was told at a certain point there were no memorials to the Great Famine in Finland, the 1860s famine in Finland. Now, I first moved to Finland in 1998, so it was the year after the 150th anniversary of Black 47 here, with lots of memorials unveiled, and it was a great shock to me that there was nothing in Finland. But I'll come on to this later. So I'll give this overview. This was a book I wrote a year or so ago. It's only in Irish, but basically it's the you can find almost everything I've written in here in some of my other articles in English as well, but it's called Éire na Russia, the Ireland of Russia, which was how Finland was described later on. So I use that as the kind of entry point for looking at some of these comparisons and contrasts with Finnish and Irish history. Then I'll look at the Great Famines and then look at some of the themes I've enjoyed working on from a comparative perspective through the lens of these memorials. I'll show you the memorials. I want to show off these pictures that I've been taking, but also I'll use them to talk about some of the other themes. And then afterwards, at the end, we'll maybe wrap up by talking about what Finland's memorials might tell us about Finland's own sense of itself, but also what we could learn about it from an Irish famine studies perspective, or I'll try to do that. I can't see a clock, so you could maybe, yeah. Because I'll talk for hours. Now I have a captive audience. So just to, to refresh your memory of where Finland is, it's here. In 1809, it went from being part of the Swedish kingdom to being a Grand Duchy of the Russian Empire. And in this map, you can see it in its Russian Empire context. So in some respects, it's a very interesting case study, irrespective of whether you're interested in Finland or not, because it's between East and West. They still talk about that a lot. I think I saw something about that today at the airport in Helsinki when I left. It's also got this odd language, which links it to Hungary in a kind of obscure way, but it's not an Indo-European language, it's a Finno-Ugrian language, so there are different affinities there. But also what's very interesting during the 19th century is, although it passed from being a part of the Swedish kingdom, the religion stayed the same. So their Lutheran population, certain values are attributed to Lutheranism, and certainly when famine strikes, the internal narrative and also the external narrative about Finland really stresses this, and probably you can guess what they are, things like being hardworking, self-reliant, and so on, and worthy of aid from an external perspective. Helsinki is actually very close, especially if you look at the vast sweep of the Russian Empire. It's actually quite close to the core, even though it's also been called an interface periphery. It's on the western edge of the Russian Empire, but also on the eastern edge of Europe. So one of the first things I learned about Finland was that there had been this great famine in the 1860s where 10% of the population had died. I was wondering why it wasn't remembered in the same way as Ireland, so I had to dig a little bit about what Finland was actually like. Why, although it's ostensibly got a similar relationship to Russia as Ireland has with Britain, does it not, for example, seem to blame the Russians for the Great Famine, even though there's quite a lot of antipathy in Finland towards Russia for other reasons throughout history? So in 1809, Finland became this autonomous Grand Duchy. I've used a kind of a metaphor here, I suppose, or a counterfactual comparison. What happened was that Helsinki was replaced Turku as the capital. It's on the south coast. Finland got its own bank, central bank, and the university also moves from Turku to Helsinki. So basically the Russian state is encouraging a shift eastwards within Finland as part of this autonomy. And one of the things we've discussed with other Irish colleagues in Finland is this: that if Napoleon would have won the Napoleonic Wars, he would never probably have thought that the Irish would have all learned French, but he might have encouraged the native Irish language as a way of breaking a cultural connection with Britain. And if you follow the Finnish comparison, then he also would have moved the capital to Cork. This is what happened really in Finland. If you can kind of imagine it, that this is my way of explaining what happened. Helsinki is closer to Russia. It sort of broke a little bit this idea that Swedish was the hegemonic language, and the Russians were quite happy for the native Finnish language to flourish, even though it later unleashed sort of Finnish nationalism or helped to develop Finnish nationalism. The Russians thought that this was actually the most practical way of getting a break with the Swedish past. You also see a kind of civil service elite in Helsinki, which is developing a distinctive Finnish national identity, and it's been described as a top-down movement, where you start to see these kind of ideas, such here as Arvidsson's famous quotation, "Swedes we are no longer, Russians we will never become, therefore let us be Finns." So the Finnish language becomes much more prevalent. It was always there in the countryside, but it becomes more investigated by academics, for example. But Swedish remains the everyday language of state and government and law and so on. But Finnish grows in importance throughout the century. Finland is able to dictate its own international trade. In 1820, the city where I'm currently working, Tampere, was founded by a man who lived in the building next to where I lived as a student at Edinburgh. There's a plaque on the wall saying that the city of Tampere was founded by this man, and I didn't think I'd end up working there. But a Quaker Scot, there's very strong Quaker connections with Finland. As I said, there's a shift in economic activity from the west coast to the south coast. This is important because it leads to economic instability within Finland, which leads to vulnerability and regional variations when it comes to the famine. And this is something that has been, in the general famine narrative in Finland, kind of brushed over. And St. Petersburg, as I said, accepts autonomy. As long as the Finns are not making any claims on the imperial treasury, they're happy for the Finns to get on with it. They're not costing anything compared with their other, especially Baltic territories, for example. They're not rebellious like the Poles. They're just quietly getting on with their lives there. So the Russians are not too bothered. And these are the key props, I suppose, of identity that become important. Omavaraisuus, which is self-sufficiency. Sivistys, which is, it's like Bildung in German, but it's not there's not really an English word. I've used education here. Sometimes it's civilization. But being self-critical and civilized and on a slightly higher plane, but through education. And internationally it was important, I think, that Kalevala was published in 1835, which was a Finnish folk epic, similar in some ways to our Ossianic cycles or so on, but it popularized Finnish mythology and folklore, and especially the Finnish language. And academics and philologists from other countries were interested in Finland. I'll just quickly... I think I'm already way behind time here. In the 1850s, Finland is in a very interesting position. There's the growth of all of these different pan-ideologies around Europe, so Germany, Italy, for example, but also Scandinavia. So there's an idea that Denmark, Norway, and Sweden would unite. And this is very popular in Britain because they would love to have a massive pan-Scandinavian state as a bulwark against Russia. But when discussing that, where does Finland fit in? So Finland is sometimes also classed as one of these potential parts of a pan-Scandinavian state. But at the same time, Finland is actually part of the Russian Empire. So when the Crimean War breaks out, the British Navy bomb the west coast of Finland. I used to use the expression back to the Stone Age when the Iraq War was more fresh in people's memories, but it was really badly damaged by the British Navy. And Quakers then are ashamed by this. The Quakers have tried to stop the Crimean War, and they saw the British Navy doing great damage to people they considered to be their friends. Lutheran in religion, hardworking, all of the qualities I mentioned earlier. So there's a Quaker visit to Finland in 1856. They established the Finnish Famine Relief Fund. And I've argued that there was no famine really when they were there. They heard rumours that there might be a bad harvest that year, but the emotive term famine, less than a decade after Black 47, was a really important element of their fundraising. So famine, I think, is being deliberately used there, but it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because the Quakers raise money for the Finns in Britain. They start then to impose terms in a similar way that we had in Ireland, that people don't just get money, they have to dig ditches or learn to fish properly, or they have to do other things to be self-sufficient. But this is the first instance of famine being used internationally in Finland, but it then becomes regular until we come to this massive crisis. Some of the other important things before we get onto the Great Famine, what I'd like to stress really, it's become more common over the last few years, but it's still, again, not seeped into popular discourse, is that I really want to get away from this idea that Finland had a one-year crisis. As I said, they were already in crisis in the 50s. There were other things called famines during the 60s. And I'll come on to this later, but I think that the idea that there was just a crisis in 1867-68 gets their own government off the hook. They said this was nature, this was God, we couldn't do anything about it. And that's something that in this current generation of PhD students in Finland has tried to stress. We talk now more about the 1860s famine, even though in Finland, in the newspapers, for example, they would still talk about 67, 68. Finland's own administration were in charge of famine relief by the 1860s. The Tsar had called a diet in 1863, seemed to accept that Finland was its own nation, and that if Finland did suffer a famine, it was going to be their own government who dealt with it. The government didn't want to relinquish any of this autonomy, so they didn't want any imperial intervention. So there was never any sense of blaming Russia after the Great Famine. But neither was there any sense of really blaming themselves. So it was the same coterie of men who were able to write the history of Finland. And the Finnish famine becomes characterized almost like an economic blip on the way to a successful economy. I won't go into this too much. This is a terrible slide in the sense it's got too much text in it, but I couldn't quite cut it properly, so I just boldened the areas that I wanted to stress. This is Cormac O'Grady's quotation that I was mentioning earlier. I think it's really interesting that there's not been a single monograph, for example, written about what's been characterized as the last great subsistence crisis of the Western world. And I was going to do a kind of simplistic analysis of how many books there are about our Great Famine in Trinity College Dublin Library or something. That's probably about 500 or something. There's not been a monograph about the Finnish famine. And actually, even in terms of articles and so on, it's very sparsely researched. So Cormac, for example, and others have been calling for comparative studies, but there just hasn't really been the material for that. So that's what inspired me to do this 5-year project, or at least to apply for it. I'll come on to these other arguments later, but just to say that this is J.V. Snellman. So he was the Prime Minister of Finland in the 1860s. He was responsible in the same way that Charles Trevelyan was arguably in Ireland for famine relief. And yet, this is a statue outside the central bank of Finland. And ironically, of course, now that the central bank's moved in Dublin, it's right opposite the Jeannie Johnson famine ship. But it's almost like we would have a statue of Trevelyan there instead of the... Of course, there are the differences I mentioned earlier. I don't want to be too simplistic, but it's... When you come at this from the point of view that you've just been through 1997 and the commemoration, so when you go to Finland, you think, what? And then you start to unpick why it is that he's not remembered as a villain, but rather as a national hero, because he got Finland through this crisis and for other things. These actually, incidentally, these are shellings from the Winter War. They were left there when the Russians bombed, or the Soviet Union bombed in 1939-40, just as a way of remembering that. So that kind of level of memorial is there. This was from Cormac's most recent book, again, just to give you some idea of the sky. Sorry, not his most recent book, actually. There's probably been about 4 since then. But in his short history of famine. And one of the things I came up against my Ukrainian colleagues when I co-edited the book looking at Finland, Ireland and Ukraine was that, well, only 150,000 people died in Finland. That's nothing. 10 million people died in Ukraine or something like that. But actually, the population of Finland was very small, and actually the percentage death rate, although it was not as high as in Ireland, either in the 1740s or 1840s, it's higher than almost anything since. And I always feel like when I grew up and we were looking at Ethiopia and so on, it is a almost shockingly high percentage death rate. But again, I would kind of, what we have here is sort of like policy failure, drought, policy failure, whereas here it just says poor harvest. It doesn't say anything about policy failure, and I think it is arguably also policy failure. In Finland, people shouldn't die because there's a bad winter, and I would even argue that you should be more prepared for a bad winter in Finland than the British authorities might have been prepared for phytophthora infestans, a disease that no one had really known about before. So, again, and in terms of the mortality rates, this is again just to show you that there were regular crises known as famine. I won't go into the description of what we define as a famine here, just to say that internationally these events were called famine. But this is the one we're really concerned with today, the 1860s. But even if you stop this in 67, or this is 66, 67, and then 68, it's getting higher and higher all the time, but it shouldn't really be seen, I'd argue, just as this one-year crisis, and especially we had this, and this is also a crisis in 62. This didn't come out very well, but this is from Spectator in 1863, talking about the terrible conditions in Finland already in 1863. This is the British consul in the town of Viipuri, or Viborg, in 1866, and I only came across this quite recently, and it made me angry, because you can see this already, April the 30th, 1866, the British consul in Viborg is condemning his own government, the Finnish authorities in Helsinki, for not reacting quickly enough, and yet 2 years later we have 10% of the population dying. So it's not that people didn't know about it, they just weren't reacting either quickly enough or for ideological reasons thought it might be something that would teach the people in the provinces a lesson, for example. These are all arguments that have been made and countered in the last few years. But it's often seen that this was caused by one night of frost in 1867, which destroyed the crops. And I think it goes against all our current thinking on famine studies to think that that could possibly happen, that one night of frost causes the deaths of so many people. But this is how it's been remembered. And again, just to reiterate, this allows nature to take the blame and ultimately then God, and not the administrative structure. This is a quotation just to, again, give you maybe a taste of what was going on in 1868. I'm not at all saying that 1867-68 wasn't an awful culmination to this crisis. And really it was the time when far more people died than in previous years. Far more international attention was brought to this. But you can see from the description here, it's very similar, very reminiscent to some of the writing about the Irish famine and also about famines we read about today. So the same kind of symptoms, people wandering around looking for work, looking for food, people going to the parochial home, and so on. This is just, I was particularly interested in this because they had a famine memorial unveiled this August, and I went to that, and it was the first time I'd actually got to see a famine memorial being unveiled in Finland itself, in Ruovesi. And before I move on to the memorials, there are 3 quotations I thought I'd put up here, which 2 of them are from an Irish comparative point of view and 1 is from a more general famine studies point of view. When the Great Irish Famine Atlas came out a few years ago, Bill Smith had this quotation: "In stressing the imperial colonial dialectic and the dynamics of Irish famine relief, one could never imagine any government, Irish government of whatever hue, turning their backs and ignoring the cry of want." So he's saying that if there had been a government in Dublin in the 1840s, they would not have ignored the starving people in the west of Ireland, for example, or anywhere in Ireland. I'm not saying that is or isn't true, I'm just saying that in Finland it shows that it's not necessarily true, that having home rule means that you don't, maybe ignore is too strong a word, but if you're trying to balance an autonomous country or duchy, you have to make economic decisions which favour certain parts of the country over the others. And to me, it's not unthinkable that somebody of Parnell's ilk in power in Dublin, if it came down to it, might have let parts of the west of Ireland starve. I don't know. But this isn't unthinkable, I think. That just because we would have had a government in Dublin, in College Green, that there wouldn't have been some kind. We would have remembered it differently. Irish historians would have written about it differently. And that's where the Finnish comparison, I think, comes in very useful. Mary Daly also, she quotes Cormac's earlier quotation But this is where I keep using this word amnesia. So I think if you have your own responsibility for looking after the famine, it is not commemorated in the same way. So there's none of the Finnish famine memorials that I've found, for example, have any political message to them at all. There's nothing talking about the oppressive regime of the imperial government or anything like this. So a lot of I've used these quotations quite a lot in recent articles because they're very useful for me to stress what I'm writing about. What I've tried to do is not write a comparative article, but put an article about the Finnish famine into an Irish famine book, and hopefully let people make their own decisions, because there just isn't time always in a 6,000 word essay to have, strictly half and half. But these quotations have been very useful. What I'm going to talk more about now is this idea of Finnish amnesia about their famine. But this is in a book that just came out this year. Alex Duvall, who's written a lot about famine based on his own fieldwork in Darfur in the 1980s, and ever since then he's worked a lot with NGOs. And I met him a couple of years ago in Ethiopia, which was really interesting. And something I've tried to do with my own work is not get too tied down in national paradigms, but also try to bring it out into the wider world of famine studies. And this really, I kind of knew this, but it really stood up to me. I was on a plane to Edinburgh about 3 weeks ago, and I was reading this, like kind of eureka. And of course this is true. He only knows of 2 cases where mass starvation was memorialized in the immediate aftermath, and that's in Leningrad and in Tigray in northern Ethiopia. And what they have in common is that that's remembered as an element of national narrative, but much more common around the world is official silence, along with local efforts to remember. And that's almost a perfect way of describing what's happened in Finland. There's nothing really known about, nothing remembered about the famine from an official point of view, but on a local level, as I've found, there's really a lot of commemoration. And I'll move on to the memorials. So I'd say in general histories of Finland, there's very limited coverage, either in Finnish, Swedish, or English, or any other language. So if you just read a history of Finland, you might get one sentence about it. The thing we've talked about with Peter quite a lot, there was an economic history of Finland published in 2006 that has one sentence on it. It says something like in 1868, 10% of the population died, and then ... And then, yeah. I was like, how can you just dismiss it like that? But it's just the way it's remembered differently. I know now, having a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old just gone through school, or going through school, they do one lesson about the famine in school. So it's not that people don't know about it at all, but it's not dealt with in any deep way or politicized. And if it is remembered, it's remembered as a time when the Finnish people crystallized into a nation. So there were lots of different regions, but actually this period was a time when austerity and hard times made people help each other. It made them realize they were Finns. It made them realize they could survive alone without imperial help. And they got through it. And in case I don't come onto it again, if you had 2 population maps of Ireland and Finland, this is another reason. The Finnish population drops severely in 68, but then it goes on as if nothing would have happened. Whereas our population, as you know, just keeps going down. So it can be characterized as a kind of economic blip in that sense, a demographic sense. It's also that there was no crime and no kind of gombinas, and no one took advantage of their neighbours, and that's just rubbish. It's actual rubbish, and you would be really shocked if it didn't happen. It's just something that happens. But this is something I used for the book. This is an article from 1894 during the Home Rule crisis, Gladstone, when Finland was also then discussing its autonomous position with Russia, and Finland was being used, as I said earlier, as the Ireland of the East. This top section, I've translated it. The position of the Finnish people cannot be compared to that of 1880s Ireland. Observance of the law and a sense of justice have always been the Finnish people's finest properties. Even during the Great Famine of 1867-8, when huge quantities of people died from lack of bread, even though they'd been very hard-working, they did not become openly violent or steal other people's property, and it was even less likely that they would plot in secret in order to hurt others. So they're not only happy about their own personality, they're also attacking ours in that sense. But this is why they didn't see Finland really as a comparator with Ireland. They felt they had much better human qualities than the Irish, and I discuss why this might be in other places. The histories of Finland were written by the same people who administered, which is important. I've also noticed there are strong local memories of suffering which are then subordinated beneath this overarching national narrative. So they say, well, in our parish 1/3 of the population died, but it was caused by the frost of the 3rd of September. They don't kind of go into much detail about why, in the neighbouring parish, hardly anybody died, and they don't discuss was it because of the poor relief mechanisms or and so on. There's the absence of the oppression narrative, which is also really important. Emigration wasn't a part of Finland's. I've argued elsewhere. Emigration was a part of Finland's famine experience, but it was rather emigration to other parts of the Russian Empire. So the Russian Empire was an opportunity. There wasn't a large angry group of Finns going to America and remembering the Russians as the imperial oppressors. And I think that is really important, especially if we're looking at the Irish memorials which popped up after 1997. I said that earlier. So when I first went there, I was told, okay, there's no national famine memorial, and there's no memorials actually of any kind. But then I started noticing that there were. So I was going around the country for various reasons. But these are what I was used to. So this is from Mayo, although it doesn't sound like it, I'm from Mayo. And this is from Swinford, in what's now the hospital, what's the poorhouse. And it explicitly has Michael Davitt, Gandhi. So we're talking about this kind of historical narrative of maybe triumph over oppression and so on. This is also in Mayo, the famine monument. I'm really not an expert on this kind of symbolism, but I've heard enough very knowledgeable people talking about it. I think this is also inspired by Holocaust memorials. I've seen similar in Dachau, for example. Pointing towards America, here's Croagh Patrick as well, and the immigration thing is also in that. And then this is from where my own family is from, Atimas in Mayo. And this is in New York, right under, that's the Freedom Tower in the background. So it's just there in Lower Manhattan in Battery Park. But it's basically a cottage from Atimas in Mayo, which was lifted brick by brick, and a meadow has been planted there also on this platform. It's crazy, but it's very evocative to go there. It's the smell. I noticed it was the smell. I went there with real cynicism, and suddenly I'm back in Atimas in the middle of Manhattan. But it seems like to my Finnish colleagues, why would you? What? This is so vulgar. Like what does this mean? But it's just this idea that the diaspora has a reason for there. That's how it looks from ground level, or from the ground level. And then of course this one, maybe the most well known. So there is none of this public art in Finland. There's no memorials to the fact that 10% of the population died. There are small local memorials, but if you think of an equivalent in Helsinki, there is nothing. In fact, in the seven largest Finnish towns, there's nothing, not even a local memorial. I'll go through these. That's not important. But to just think of Mayo, if we think, I don't want to be too much going on about Mayo, but if you think of Mayo as a particular focus of the famine, this is the part of Finland which actually the highest mortality rate. This is showing mortality during famine. Over 25% of the population died. Around about 35% of the population died in the parish of Parkano. And this is the memorial they have there in their graveyard. It's just something that was put up at the time, a small stone. And I found it after a lot of hard work. I thought there must be something in Parkano because I'd found so many others, but I couldn't find it. And I saw a local newspaper article saying there was one. So I was poking around the graveyard there, and it's here. It's behind the bench there. So all I do really with this is just to compare it. If we compare it of the one in Murrisk, for example, the skeleton ship. And actually this was the epicenter of the Great Finnish Famine. This is what is used to memorialize it there. It's a local memorial. In some ways I find it more moving, this kind of thing. And also I want to remember this is, despite the New York memorial, which was taken from Atimas, this is the graveyard in Atimas where my own relatives who died during the famine would be. in a mass graveyard. There was no memorial there. And this is something I learned, especially from writing this chapter, is not to conflate what happened after 1997 with what went before. And in Ireland, there was a lot of these local memorials or graveyards, which were known as famine graveyards, but which didn't have the memorial. So in that way, I feel like prior to writing this chapter, I've been guilty of comparing two slightly different phenomena. But because it was the 150th anniversary of the famine in Finland this year, I was very interested to see if anything would really happen. And really now I can look back on it and say nothing really did happen. There was no real public discussion of it, not to any great extent. Mainly if there were discussions, and not to be self-regarding, it was partly inspired by my work and why is a foreigner doing this. And there was an article, for example, in their main newspaper about my work, and then that stimulated something. But I do get the feeling that it's a bit odd. Why aren't we remembering this? This foreign guy has come and done this, but we are not remembering it. But I still think it's over now. They'll move on to something else. How long do I have, Peter?
20 minutes.
Oh, okay. So these are the famine memorials. So I was told there were no famine memorials in Finland. I've found now nearly 100. And I want to make, I don't know if we can prove this or if we'll ever can be bothered proving this, but I feel as though there's almost likely to be more in Finland than there were in Ireland in 1997, like prior to the explosion of new memorials. But almost all of them are local, small scale, in a graveyard, probably in the proximity of a mass grave, for example. This, to give you some scale, this is Ireland superimposed. It's a really big country. And for example, one, I knew there were a few up here, and I took my younger son during a school holiday in the car in February in the snow for a trip. So we set out from here in the morning and we finished here. And to give my cousins some idea of how far we'd gone, I'll look on the map and see how far that is in Irish terms. But actually it was the same as driving from Cork to Edinburgh. And it's just something you wouldn't really think of doing. But in Finland, because the distances are big, of course if you're from North America or something, it's a different thing again. But if you're from a smaller country, the size of Finland is quite surprising. But my own geography has now changed. So I think nothing of driving 3 hours just to go and find some memorial. The colours here are not really important for your perspective. They're just the different provinces. So it's just see them a bit more clearly in provincial terms. And I've mapped them here onto mortality. So I thought it was interesting. When I look at this, I think, well, actually this is not surprising because these are the areas where there were the greatest mortality. So I thought I'd put it, this is a bit out of date now, there's only 78 on this one, but this is from the book. But there's a very close correlation with where the mortality was worse. So we often use this idea that a tenth of the population died. Sometimes it's more like a seventh. It depends what the length of the famine is given as. But in some of these areas, it was much more like 1/3 of the population died during those times. And there's a very strong local memory of that, which really doesn't get recognized at a national historiographical level. And I just made this one to where I knew the date of the inauguration. Just have a look, and you can see, not surprising to a certain extent, that during the centenary in the 1960s, there is a spike of that. But then, if you think, why was that when there wasn't any great interest shown now this year when it was the 150th anniversary? I'll come on to it maybe a little bit more after, but one of the problems, I remember now in my final slide, I call it the capriciousness of history. Exactly 50 years after the Great Finnish Famine, Finland got independence. So that's what's remembered. So every 50th anniversary of the famine or 100th anniversary of the famine is going to be the 100th anniversary or the 150th anniversary. So the newspaper columns, the public funding, and it's of course a much more celebratory narrative. So last year Finland celebrated its 100th anniversary. And it was much more pleasant to remember that than to remember the 150th anniversary of the Great Famine. There's also an idea that after World War II, so lots of Finns perished fighting the Soviet Union, for example, in 39-44 period. There was much more self-reflection after that point, and colleague Ilona Bajarek has argued that this was a watershed in terms of public commemoration. So then more of these mass graves, which were still remembered but were starting to pass out of memory, it became much more important to put something there to crystallize the memory of that site. So this is why that kind of happens at that point. I also wonder, you can see sometimes patterns that the local, one parish puts up a memorial, the neighbouring parish puts it up 2 years later. And I presume this is something to do with the local newspaper coverage or something that's actually we had also just as bad a time, so we should do something here. So they kind of spread around a bit like that. I'm going to go through a few slides now which show some of the ones I've found, but also I've put them into a thematic rather than geographical or chronological order. So these are 4 sites which speak to work, relief work. And one of the things I've been very interested about with the Great Finnish Famine is that, as with Ireland, there was no relief given without a work task. And this is something we've always held against the imperial government. But it's obviously something that was not just confined to Trevelyan or his friends. It's something that was obviously a European-wide or maybe global phenomenon, and it's not even necessarily remembered as a negative thing. So this road, this memorial, for example, is showing how a bridge was built before people were given flour. This was a road that was built, and during the refugee crisis, I saw some online forums talking about this memorial, saying that, look, we helped ourselves. We should do that. Why don't those Syrians do the same? And it was actually being used as a kind of way of saying that we were different from these ones. I'm not saying that's a general argument being made in Finland. I'm just saying this was some people arguing like that online. This was a canal that was built in the east. 267 people buried there. And this kind of Stonehenge thing is actually made out of the stone bridge that was built over the crossing. So they actually used the material that was there when they built the new bridge. They made a memorial out of the old one. But it just was not acceptable that charity could be given without a work task in return, and a lot of the memorials reflect that. A lot of them also depict the crop that failed, the rye crop especially, but cereals in general, but it's usually given as rye. These are just 4 examples here, and it's something that, apart from a few rare instances, we don't, for example, have memorials with potatoes on here. But I think there's something in this that, again, God had taken away the means of subsistence, and that this needs to be remembered. You'll notice here, all of these are in churchyards, and the Lutheran Church has often been the prime mover in putting up these memorials. I'll come on to that in a second. And just similarly, quern stones are used in memorials as well. This is one of the most challenging ones to find. This was during the winter, and it's a kind of recumbent quern stone. And my son actually saw a little bit in the middle of the graveyard, which was slightly. I was pleased with him with that, but we found it and we dug it out. This was when I realised what I was doing was kind of intrinsically funny, despite the serious nature of the subject. But just this foreign guy going around graveyards in Finland with a torch and a shovel, and having to explain himself to people. So I thought I should tell some more people about it. The mother motif, something which is quite universal. You see this today with famine relief, fundraising, other tragedies. Rohingya people, you often, I'm speaking again from Red Cross campaigns in Finland, for example, but you see very similar pictures going around. Alex Duval, I'll come on to this. This is a famous picture, obviously, of the woman begging at Clonakilty. This image was used in 1917 in an account about the Great Finnish Famine, and they're so strikingly similar that I wonder was one inspired by the other. But if you happen to see Alex Duval's book about Darfur from 1985, the picture of the Darfuri woman on the cover is almost exactly the same again. So this with a baby here and with a head covering and looking, down like that. I'll talk a little bit about the context of that article as well, because I think it's interesting. The Civil War erupted after independence, but I just wanted to show that image, and because we're here, this politicization of that image, I don't think this is still there in Ballymurphy. It's gone, isn't it? Yeah. But it's thankfully still online, so it'll always be here. But I only show it here to show this politicization of a thing, which would just never happen in Finland. There would be no... People would just not even have the mental vocabulary to understand what point you're trying to make if you use this image in some kind of political context. And this then also made me think about the role of the Lutheran Church, and this kind of came slightly more from my background in Scottish history. So my PhD was on comparative Irish and Scottish history, and one of the things that we were always wondering about was why the Irish were seen to be wild. So I did about the land war. So the Irish were kind of wild, bogmen. The Scottish Highlanders were seen to be loyal and uninflammable. And Chris Smout, we were just discussing with Liam, talks about the uninflammable people. You can do to them what they want, but they don't rebel, as opposed to the wild Irish. And I've been thinking about that a lot with the Finnish case. The Lutheran Church has done a lot of... Again, I don't want to be the person who either attacks the Quakers or who necessarily attacks the Finnish Lutheran Church, especially as a foreigner. But it's never been subjected to a real critique of whether they were compliant with the administration in sort of thinking that these deaths were either a visitation from God or that people needed to learn these lessons about self-reliance, the lessons that Luther taught, and so on. So what you often find is on the right here, this is a memorial in Soini, and it says during the Great Hunger years of 1866 to 68, parishioners from here died, 354 parishioners died, and this stone is put up in their memory in 1966. Lord, give us this day our daily bread. And this quotation is used, I'd say, on 30 of the 100 famine memorials I found. I should look up more, but this give us this day our daily bread is very common. But on this one, it's slightly different. It's from a book called Saarijärven Paavo, which was one of the canonical books of Finnish literature, but also a very didactic story about a peasant farmer who is self-sufficient and gets through adversity because he has all these qualities that Finns are supposed to have. And this quotation here says, so, although you may be tested, do not abandon the Lord. So it's this kind of feeding into this idea that, as I said earlier, the government was trying to infuse into the Finnish people that this is just part of being Finnish. You suffer like this, and then you come through it. Because nature here is hard. You can't just survive because the climate is so bad and so on. And I think it's very useful to a certain extent it might be true, but it's also very useful to argue that if you feel you are responsible for causing these these problems or so on, or you don't want people to think you are responsible for causing these problems. These are just some pictures from Highland history. There's one kind of secret. I think I need to go back to doing something about the Highlands as we keep discussing. Sorry, I'm in that one. That's a new shiny one. Mass graves are another common sight. These all have the kind of 2,100 people were buried in this mass grave in Pielavesi, 213, 1,553 there, and something like 60 on that one. So local sites which are mass graves have then had these memorials put upon them. And then there's something about the idea that people knew this was a mass grave, but the generation is dying out who know about it, so we need to do something to preserve the memory. And one such site is here in Perho. And this is something which upset me again. I sometimes get upset by this, which is maybe just part of being human, but just the one source which hasn't really been used very much is the memoirs of the Finnish Folklore Commission, which are held in the archives of the Finnish Literary Society. And if you remember back to the 90s, Carl Portier's book, Famine Echoes, was a bestseller, really. He went through the Irish Folklore Commission and put things in a thematic way about the Great Irish Famine. We had an idea to do the same with the Finnish equivalent a couple of years ago. There was no interest at all. No publisher would touch it because they said nobody would sell. No one would buy it. So it's again a kind of striking difference between attitudes towards the famine. But I really want to use a lot of these, if I can, in my monograph, just to illustrate some of these. Of course, these are people who lived through the famine, and their memories are not maybe what they were, but I still think they're a really interesting way of illustrating, and especially getting past some of the official history. And this was an upsetting story, and it speaks to something I was talking about later, that people didn't take advantage of each other. So Jaakko, which is the Finnish for James or Seamus, he was working on a road construction scheme, and he was starving, and he asked the foreman that could he have some bread, some white bread, he said. And the foreman said, no, you can't work. So I need some bread. And he said, okay, I'll give you some bread if you do a forward roll for me in the snow. So it kind of humiliates him by that. And he can't do it. He's too weak. Sort of splays, looks like me doing a forward roll, and splays all over the place. Second time he tries, can't do it. Third time he actually succeeds. And the laughing foreman says, oh, here you are, have some bread. And of course he dies instantly, almost from having this bread. So on the one hand, this memory speaks to the idea that people were cruel to each other. There was not this sort of egalitarianism that you often get promoted, but also that the story links it actually to the site here that I found in Berha, because many of Jaakko's comrades, this is the very end of the story, the informants, as many of Jaakko's comrades followed him to the frosty soil of the churchyard in the next, this is my translation, so it sounds a bit weird, but death had lost its meaning in the minds of the living. That's what I called today's talk. No one was afraid of it when it revealed its ruthless grin, not to mention when it stroked someone else. Life was grim and hopeless. Constantly knowing hunger numbed the most sensitive of feelings. Death was the only liberator from the seemingly endless misery. That's why people weren't afraid of it. I dedicate these few incomplete rows, as the lines he was speaking, as some kind of monument for this victim of the hunger winter, whose final resting place at Jankaharju Cemetery was never marked, even with a simple wooden cross. And what I didn't realise at first was this is Jankaharju. I just know this is Perho, a church, but Harju means like a ridge or whatever, so this is what locals call. And this is the famine memorial here from 1867, 68. So they put a stone there at the time. So you're able to make these connections by looking at the memorials, going through the folklore and the memoirs and so on. I think it brings up a bigger picture of the local experience, and something I've found really rewarding. I'll talk about this as well. So one of the most important relief works, I'll just talk about this and then go on to the conclusions that we might discuss. This is a quotation from Agaton Meurman, who is one of the leading nationalists in Finland, friend of the administrators, one of these men I've been talking about, who then wrote the subsequent history. So he wrote this history called the hunger years of the 1860s in 1893, ironically, or probably deliberately, when Finland was then going through another famine at that point. He said, a more valuable gravestone than the Riihimäki-St. Petersburg Railway could not have been erected to the memory of our nameless fallen. So he's just saying it's this idea that the relief roads and the relief railways the relief works which constructed roads, railways and canals, that was the only memorial that was needed. Because those were the things that these people died building, and those were the sort of engines for Finland's subsequent economic growth. So in the 1890s, when it's being rationalised how to remember what these terrible events which had happened in the 60s, this is the main argument that's used. We don't need to put up memorials all over the place. Just look at the roads. Look at this. This is still the same railway that we use today, linking Helsinki, which is here. It goes. If you want to go to St. Petersburg, it goes like this. So it is a long-lasting memorial, if you want to see it like that. Certainly it's a lieu de mémoire, a sort of place of memory or whatever. But this was the reason given why you didn't need to have actual memorials. And nevertheless, at all of these sites, there are memorials. And you can see with some of them, they use train track to have the crosses there. This is in Lahti, this is in Uusikylä. This is from the time, here lie the dead railway builders. And this is a stone that was put on a mass grave in 1862 already. And the other thing I found from these memorials, it's a bit like putting together it's not really like putting together a jigsaw. I've used the analogy, I don't know, it wasn't original, but I can't remember where I got it from. But if you have an old telly and you look very closely at it, it was just green and red and blue dots. But when you pull back a bit, it had the full picture. So when we've been trying to discuss how to popularize or how to make people think beyond the idea that this was just a one-year crisis, this is what I found to be the most useful. If you look at the different memorials locally, they're all dated from different times. So there is a kind of prevalence of 1866 to 1868, but if you actually take them all, you get a spread from 1862 to 1869. This is in Pihlajamäki Wilderness Church, 62 to 67, in Ullova, 65 to 68, in Tohmajärvi, the same. Every third Tohmajärvi parishioner died of hunger, 65 to 68. And in Lohtaja, sorry, I know these place names don't mean much. They wouldn't even mean much to somebody in my own institution in Finland either, so it doesn't really matter. Point being that there is a long spread here. And it's maybe, if we think of our Great Famine, you could just, if we were taking the Finnish attitude, say our Great Famine was in 1847. In Finland, they say it is only in 1 year, but actually you can argue it's longer. And I'm never trying to say one way is right and one way is wrong. I think it's just really interesting to look at how these things are conceptualized differently. So can I just conclude? So I think one of the things to take away is this idea that I've used the term phenoman here. This was the name given to the nationalist movement, kind of conservative Finnish nationalists who were running the autonomous country, the phenoman. So there's no need for any other memorials because we'd come through this crisis together. It had helped bind the country together, and what had happened, the government coped as well as it could in the face of this terrible assault from God, and its wise decisions to build railways and roads and canals actually then were proved correct, like 40 or 50 years later. So there's also a building block approach. I say something I didn't really mention. A lot of these memorials are also in graveyards in close proximity to people on the white side who died during the Civil War. So Finland had a civil war immediately after its independence, which reflected the Russian Civil War, Reds against Whites. The Whites won, and the Whites were given individual, very neat graveyards in their local parish. They were all repatriated to their local parish, and whenever you go around Finland, you see these white Civil War graves. The Reds were bundled into mass graves gradually, generally. And the famine memorials are often in close proximity to those. So it becomes part of this story of different crises which the Finnish people have come through. So the famine, the attack from their own Reds, and then the attack from the Soviet Union in the 30s and the 40s. And also the flight from Karelia when Russia took over part of Karelia in the 1940s. And the Asikkala, the memorial there that I mentioned, actually has all of these things in one memorial. So that's when I found that I was really pleased because it kind of slightly proved this point. I think the recovery of population was rapid. If you look at histories of Finland written in the 1960s and 1970s, if it mentions the famine at all, it almost gives it just as, it was a prompt for getting our act together and reforming agriculture. And we did it well, and we benefited from it. I would love to talk more about this, but I think if the Reds, I don't want to say that I think the Reds should have won. I don't want to get accused of that, but I just think if the Reds had won, there was starting to emerge in 1916, 1917, a narrative which was blaming the Helsinki authorities for what happened in the 1960s, a Red narrative. If the Reds had won the Civil War, that would have become the dominant narrative of Finnish history, I'm quite sure. As it happened, a 50th anniversary commemoration was held, but it was on the same week that the Whites had their victory parade in Helsinki. So I think it killed off for many generations this idea of criticizing the government. Mary Daly talks of amnesia. That's not fair. I mean, Mary Daly knows what she knows that this is not just a question of amnesia, because she uses it to discuss much broader issues. So I'm not saying that she just thinks that the Finns are suffering from amnesia, but if there is amnesia, it's willful, I'd say, and it's highly selective, because in lots of these local communities there is not, to the same extent as on the national level, amnesia. But there is no other, as there is in Ireland or Ukraine, for example. It's much part of a national story of self-sacrifice. I mentioned this already, the capriciousness of history. It's just a simple fact, a practical fact, that if you have a certain amount of public funding for commemoration, these things are always forever going to be 50 years out of step. So, and even there was a certain point last year when my work really seemed to capture the imagination of the public. I was on the news a few times and so on. Yeah, I like to think that this discussion of memorials also adds to this idea that the crisis was a much longer duration, and that in a certain sense you could use them to think that there's a metropolitan elite who are not really caring that much about the countryside. I'm very that the length of the famine is perceived differently in different localities, whereas the people in Helsinki are looking at this from an outside perspective. In Ireland, as I said, there's a significant change of emphasis after 1997. In case of Finland, they don't have the Finnish communities outside of Finland involved in famine memorialization. Weirdly, I found a few cases where there are actually Finnish Americans saying that we came here after the Great Famine of the 1860s, but they just didn't. And I think they've kind of conflated it with the Irish narrative, and think that, I don't know, and I don't really want to make that claim, but I just get the feeling that the Irish famine narrative amongst emigre Irish is so strong that other emigrant communities that have had a famine probably just take it on as taken for granted that when you have a famine you emigrate to America. And again, when we had the 1990s, 1997 especially, there was the context of the Good Friday Agreement, Tony Blair apologising for the famine, or those kind of things in a much broader context of apologies for imperialism and so on around the world. This was not something that would occur to somebody in Finland. No one would want Vladimir Putin to apologise for the Great Finnish Famine. It would set off all kinds of wrong signals. And there's no other then. The only thing I found a letter in 1985 when a memorial was unveiled in a town called Mäntsälä, and in a local newspaper a guy wrote saying that this should help us to identify with the people of Ethiopia in 1985. But I've never seen any other real, as a way of raising money for them in a kind of Live Aid type way. And I suppose I'll finish, sorry, I just have one more slide, but I'll just finish with this idea that a famine could not be caused by nature alone for an Irish nationalist, but for a Finnish nationalist it's almost totally the other way around. It could only be caused by nature. And I just want to show you this. This is what I'm kind of competing with. This is 1867 on it. It's flat on the ground. It's about this big, and it's covered in grass. And when my work was in the national newspaper, a local journalist phoned me up from this place and said, "Hey, have you heard of the hunger stone?" And I said, "No, I haven't. That sounds really great. I'll come and have a look at it." And so I did. But the headline here says, "The hunger stone surprises Irish researcher. He hopes to come to visit as soon as possible." But I would never have found, I never would have found this. Like, you could be going around Finland for many lifetimes and never find it. So it's great that if your stuff gets some publicity, people actually come and get in touch with you. But I've been back there since then and taken a picture where I'm being surprised, because I like this. I know this from an Irish point of view as well, the local newspaper, how it reports these kind of things. That we had one that he didn't know about. So I just wanted to leave you with that. And there's a few things if you...